This will be about the war years, 1940 to 1945. Okay? In 1938, my sisters and I were living in Holland, in The Hague, with a Dutch family who were taking care of us while my parents were living in Tehran, Persia. In the spring of 1939, my mother came home from Persia and decided to remain in Holland to be with us. She rented a house near my father's brother, Nick, and his family, and we were all much happier being together with her. In April of 1940, my father returned from Persia for a long home visit, a home leave, and then we were scheduled to continue on to Venezuela, which was his next post. When he returned, I recall a lot of discussions about possible war, whether Holland would remain neutral as they did in World War II, whether we would be affected at all. And as a 12-year-old, I wasn't terribly interested, but I remember hearing discussions about a possible war. On May 10, at 5 in the morning, we all woke up because of the tremendous noise of planes flying very low over our houses. So we all jumped out of bed and we saw German planes. We could see the markings on the wings. So in a bit it dawned on us that actually war had begun, quicker than anybody had thought, I believe. Was a lot of excitement. We had a sports field behind our house, and they had mounted some anti-aircraft guns on there, and they were trying to shoot down planes. I never saw one shot down, but I know they did shoot down some. And it was very exciting. Then 5 days, of course, the war was over, and we capitulated, and the Germans actually then entered The Hague. They'd entered Holland, of course, earlier, and then came to The Hague, and that was on May the 10th, I believe. No, that must have been 5 days later. I recall standing on a main drag in The Hague, watching the German armies go along a very long road to the barracks, which apparently they'd taken all the Dutch soldiers away somewhere, and they went to occupy these barracks. And I remember even at that age being so struck by the huge military might they seemed to have. They were all in tanks, huge tanks. And I recall during those few years of war, which didn't really touch The Hague, but we did have a lot of Dutch soldiers running around on their bicycles. And I thought the contrast between the bicycles and the German tanks was just emblematic of that. There was no way the Dutch could have won a war. That they lasted 5 days is already, I think, quite an achievement. So, war was over then. There's nothing we could do. We went back to school. And then for us children, at any event, life returned quite normally to normal. However, as time went on, we began to hear stories which were very distressing. In those 5 days of war, a lot of people tried to leave Holland. They went to all the harbors and tried to get any boat, ship, anything that had an engine, rowboats, I don't know, to leave. Many of them did not succeed. Many did get away at the last minute, but it was not easy to get away. There were some really terrible stories. A friend of mine, whose father was the editor of a very large publishing company, he had published and written very many anti-Nazi books and papers. He tried to get away with his family. However, he did not succeed. So he sent his family back to The Hague and he committed suicide. He knew that if they caught him, they might get his family too. So he did it to save his wife and his 2 children. There were some Dutch patriots who felt, particularly military, who felt they could not live in a country that was occupied by the Germans, and they committed suicide for those reasons. At some point, the Foreign Office was abolished as Holland became integrated into the German Reich, and my father was fired and received a very small pension. It's not clear to me how he lived, actually, because it wasn't enough to maintain a family, and I believed he borrowed from the bank for the remaining 5 years of the war, and I think that he had some securities which they thought might sometime come back to them, but nobody knew. It could have been a huge debt he could have never been repaid. So people were going on faith. I mean, everybody was sort of banding together against the Germans. My sister started university in that fall, and I believe that she finished, my sister Honey, my older sister, I believe that she had maybe a year of normal university life, and then the trouble began, and that also involved university, because the Germans began a crackdown on the Jews and required them to wear a star. Everybody was shocked at this, but it seemed on the surface harmless, because at the time I don't think anybody had any idea what was going to follow. And the way it affected the university was that there was a very well-known professor who was Jewish at the University of Leiden, and they immediately fired all of the Jewish faculty. And this particular professor was very much loved and respected. And so the students protested, and they had quite a riot at the University of Leiden. And finally, the Germans got so fed up, they were not able to put it down. First the Dutch police tried, and then the Germans became involved, and they started picking up students and putting them in jail. So eventually the Germans thought, well, we'll just close the entire university, and that's what they did. So the university remained closed for the remainder of the war. My sister managed to continue her education by special classes, sort of underground, and private tutoring, but she was lucky in that she was close to the university and she still had rooms there, so they could sort of sub rosa manage to do these things. A lot of students, I don't know what happened to them. However, I think to some degree one knows, because students were then being picked up because they were recruited to work in factories in Germany. So that caused many young men to go underground in various and sundry ways. Not only did they begin to work for the underground as such, but generally they just had to disappear. Many families built shelters in their houses. They would build little hiding places that you couldn't see. I know my uncle did for his son. I never saw it, but it was very cleverly hidden. And when the Germans would knock at the door to look for young men, and they had everybody's addresses, he would be told to hide in there. And in fact, they knocked on the door. And my aunt was home, and my cousin was home. This is my cousin Peter. And he was warned that the Germans were at the door. He flew up the stairs, totally forgot that there was a hiding place built for him, climbed up on the roof. His was one of the tallest roofs in the neighborhood, and somehow climbed up and held on to the chimney. And there he was. The Germans went all through the house. My aunt said she didn't know where he was. He was out, but no young man went on the streets, because you would be picked up by the Germans if they saw you. So they went all through the house. They never thought to look on the roof. The whole neighborhood in the meanwhile was looking out the window thinking, now why is Peter Vickers up in that roof? Anyway, the Germans left. He went down off the roof, and he didn't get caught. So he disappeared. I mean, he went in hiding somewhere. I don't know where he went. I saw him occasionally. In the meanwhile, people were beginning to be evacuated from their houses. The closer to the Dutch beaches they were, the more they needed to be evacuated. And nobody knows this, I don't think, but we actually had a wall in The Hague, like a Berlin Wall. It was the Hague Wall, which totally separated The Hague into two pieces, with the side near the ocean being totally closed off to all of us. So we were told to evacuate, and we found a place um, in a street that was about to be evacuated, but as long as they weren't, they had been partially evacuated. We found shelter there for, I don't know, a period of 6 months to a year, I don't recall. It was very odd to live there because actually we were the only ones in that particular section of street. And we had electricity, I think. I don't think we had much heat. But it was a very quiet place, and my sister and I would explore into the gardens, and some houses were open. We'd peek around the houses, but there wasn't a soul there. It was like living in a ghost town. I should say one thing about the Germans. The German soldier, that throughout the war, to my knowledge, the German soldier behaved quite well. They were not allowed to loot or run havoc anywhere. Because I think, as opposed to maybe Bulgaria or Hungary or places they didn't think were their, racial equals or whatever you want to call it, they would raise all sorts of manners of hell, but we were supposed to be like them. We were supposed to be a Germanic race, and we were going to be integrated into the German Reich. And I believe that's what saved us. This is to say they never did anything, but I never saw a German misbehave. They would mainly stay in their barracks, or they'd walk along in big groups in order, singing songs and just being, well-behaved soldiers. Maybe there's an anecdote I should tell you about a friend of my sister's who was accosted by a German soldier. And he was a young guy of 18 from a farm somewhere, and he wanted to be friendly. He was really not a bad guy at all. And she began to talk to him, and he said, why are people so unfriendly to us? Because we're here to save you from your horrible queen. And so she gave him a long lecture on that we wished to be saved from the queen, that she wasn't a bad person, and we didn't like to be occupied. And he was totally taken aback because he'd been told a story that they were rescuing us. So he said he was fascinated, and he had to go home to his barracks. And she went home. It was all very peaceful. He had made a date with her. He said, could we please talk some more? Because I never heard any of this before. So they made a date, which of course she did not keep. But it gives you a little insight in the German soldier mentality. They had no clue what they were there for. Well, our next address was, as I told, this totally deserted street. And I had one little encounter with a German there. There was a little back path which I would sometimes use to get to my house. And while I was walking there, some drunk came along and began to bother me. And I wasn't at all afraid. He was so drunk I could have shoved him off. However, this German soldier, laden down with grenades and weapons and what have you, came walking along and saw this man and started yelling at him and told him to go away fast, and he ran fast. And I was totally dumbfounded. I didn't know how could I even speak to a German soldier. But I kind of gave him a little smile, and I did speak to him, but I left, and he did try to help. I don't think I was in any trouble. But it gave you the sense how we were totally trained in hating the Germans. When you didn't speak to them, if they looked to you, didn't look at them, you ignored them, they were like air. And, even thinking that I smiled at a German soldier, I felt guilty. So that's that little tale. There was nothing exciting happening there. We then had to evacuate. That also became part of the area near the beach, which the Germans wanted to keep clear. And then we moved back to another house where we had lived when we were children, staying with this Dutch family who were taking care of us. And we occupied the ground floor, which had no bathroom. It had a toilet, but it had no bathroom. But it had one room with a sink, and my father borrowed an old-fashioned Victorian bath, which was about this big. The sides were about this tall, and you could push this under your sink, and then you could splash in there, and eventually, with cold water, because there's no more hot water, we would wash in that little sink, all five of us. The tub was quite an issue for us because as the weather got cold and we had no hot water, we were standing in this big round tub and in front of the sink, washing ourselves in this very cold water. My sister Honey and I did it every day. We were insane to do it, I think, and my mother. My father and my sister Jackie were a little more cautious, particularly when it got colder. So, but Honey and I persisted. So that was difficult. And not having a full bathroom and being able to turn a faucet and get hot water and what you brush your teeth with in that ice cold water. And sometimes we began to run out of soap, and my mother would save all the bits of soap we had anywhere, and she'd boil it up and make more soap somehow. I don't know how she did that. Anyway, that was in this last address, the Levenstraat 98, I believe the number was. We had two big rooms on the ground floor. One had been the summer sitting room, and one had been the winter sitting room, and then there was a dining room. The dining room became our sitting room, and the two remaining rooms were our bedrooms. And the dining room was a relatively small room, although it could seat a huge table with 12 people easily. But it was the smallest and the most easily heated. And that was our kitchen, it was our living room, but we didn't sleep there, we slept in the other two rooms. I should tell about how we cooked. As the food got harder to get, and I should get to that in a minute, my mother rigged up a big can, about this, like a Hawaiian punch can. She punched a hole in the bottom and a couple of holes in the top, and we'd feed it with little twigs. We had a pan sitting on top, and whatever food we cooked was cooked on that thing, which sat on another little kacheltje, what is a kacheltje, a little stove, which was sticking out through the window. My mother's very clever. She rigged up all these things. So we had a pipe going through a window, and that's how we cooked. And we had to clean the pipe every day because wood creates a lot of mess. And so every day we had to take the pipe apart, shake it out in the kitchen and beat it so that God could get out, then assemble it so we could cook yet another meal on this little can. Which maybe bring us to the Hunger Winter, which was started in September of 1944, which was when the Allies had their attack on Arnhem, which failed. The Dutch railroads went on strike in sympathy with this attack on Arnhem, hoping to expedite everything. However, due to a number of reasons I won't go into, it was a total failure. The Germans demanded that the railroads get back and continue their usual work, but the railroad strikers suspected that a lot of them would be picked up if they turned up for work and refused to return. So the Germans said, okay, no railroads, no food, and that was the beginning of the Hunger Winter. Some people, I think, made out pretty well if they had huge supplies, and there were always those who had huge supplies. But us, we did not do so well because we'd been moving, and you can't really move huge supplies of food. We never had them to begin with. So that became very tricky. So there were two ways to get food. One was through the underground, the black market dealers, which was an unpleasant business. But eventually we were forced to do so because we couldn't get food otherwise enough to feed us. The other one was through foraging. And so we'd forage. We'd get on our bikes while we still had bikes and go out into the country and forage. We'd go to farmhouses and knock on doors, and we might get a little pack of some kind of ground wheat or some kind of a meal that my mother would cook up into porridge or bake into something. Mostly it was cooked up in some kind of pop as some kind of a cereal. We also went foraging, and I remember my biggest coup was I got sugar beets. Sugar beets, we don't have sugar cane in Holland, we have sugar beets. Sugar beets are big, clunky things. And I must have had 50 kilo of beets on my bike. My bike was shaking the whole way home. I couldn't ride it, of course, I had it loaded down with all these beets. and it literally was shaking under the weight of it. And when I came home, I remember my father weighing it and saying, you know, you have about X number of kilos, but it was a lot. So what my mother would do, I could give you a recipe for sugar beets. You peel them, you cook them. It takes forever, and we're feeding little twigs in there to keep it going. Eventually, I guess we peeled them, and then she would cook them so long till we got the syrup out of it, the sugar. And what she would do then, that would be reserved for if we had some kind of cereal, we could add a little flavoring to it. And the pulp, she shredded, and we pretended it was an Indonesian food or a Chinese food, and we'd put all sorts of spices on it. You could buy spices anywhere because you can live with spices. And of course it had absolutely no nourishment, and you'd eat it. However, it did fill you up for a little while, and but not for long. It didn't last very long. Another thing we did was eat tulip bulbs. So we cooked those up, and we all got terribly sick eating them. So we stopped eating them. We only had them about twice, and each time we got sick. It turned out, I found out years later, there is a little germinating center that you have to remove. It's in the heart of the tulip, and we didn't know that. But I remember it being very dissatisfying. It tastes rather like chestnuts, the chestnuts you could roast. And I couldn't eat chestnuts for many years, but I now like them again. But for many years they reminded me too much of being sick with these tulip bulbs. The other thing we did is, we walked a lot. When our bicycles gave out, we'd walk up to 8 hours a day, going into the country looking for stuff. We had packs on our backs. And my sister Honey and I did a lot of that walking too. And one day we were out in the country somewhere, but not far from the university town of Leiden, when a horse and buggy came along, just a wagon and a horse and a man. And we were so tired, we asked if he would let us ride with him on the back of this cart. So he said, sure. So Honey and I were sitting on these lumpy bags. And my sister looked at me and said, you know what we were sitting on? I said, no, what are we sitting on? Potatoes, she said. So we sort of looked astonished. We hadn't seen potatoes for a very long time. So she said to the man, I noticed you have potatoes. Are they for sale by any chance? Oh, sure, he said. So we looked at each other, and Mahoney looked to see how much money she had. And then they bargained over the potatoes, and he said, sure, he'd sell you potatoes. So not only did he sell us the potatoes, he actually went into the town on the cobblestones, clop, clop, that horse walking along, to where her rooms were, and we lugged two bags of jute bags of potatoes, lugged them up to the third floor where her apartment was. And we were sitting on these potatoes thinking, it's like heaven, you know, we haven't had a potato, and they're really good food. So for the next period of time, whenever we could, you could occasionally get a train ride, but they'd be more like cattle cars, you know, not really cattle or freight cars. But mostly we walked, and then we got the bag of potatoes and walked back. So that's, I don't know how long the walk that is, a couple of hours. It's a long walk. So this is a coup I will never forget, because it kept us really fed for a little while. Not very long, there were 5 of us. So then the underground, or rather the black market merchants got very active, because as hunger came worse and worse, you know, you had to do something. We couldn't always go out and be in the country foraging around. So I think my parents spent a lot of money buying food, just bits here and bits there. Black market guy would come and we'd fork over some money. He'd give us maybe a loaf of bread or a little cheese. But the biggest coup, which cost us the most, was a huge cheese. It's one of those big Dutch round cheeses. You've probably seen them at Whole Foods. They're about this tall, and they're really like a wheel size. My mother traded it for a diamond ring. It broke her heart, and she often said, I wonder what farm lady is walking around with my ring. But she had to give it up. And I think it kept us alive, because every morning she'd give us one slice of cheese, and we'd eat it slowly, and it's a lot of nourishment in cheese. So during that hunger winter, particularly in the winter part of it, we often didn't get up till very late unless we had to go foraging, because it took too much energy to get up and wash and do all of that stuff, and there was nothing to get up for. There was no light, it was dark, so we slept a lot. And then we'd start stirring around midday to get food and to get the whatever she had to start cooking this little pot. Which brings us to another thing. Of course, to have these little twigs, we had to get wood. And that got very hard to get. So there was a forest nearby, and we would go there and see what we could find in the way of branches and things, which my father would saw up, and then we would make them small. Occasionally, black market dealers caught on to the shortage of wood, and we would hear this big sawing going on. And as soon as we heard it, we'd make a beeline for wherever the sound came from. And there were usually big marketeers taking down a big tree. So we'd all stand around like sort of ravens, standing around a prey. And the minute the tree came down, we'd rush and get a branch. And the most awful thing happened to me. I had hold of a branch, and I started carrying it off, and some other woman began to pull at the other side of the branch. Well, I was younger and stronger than she was, so I won the battle and got my branch home. But it felt awful to do that, to fight over a branch, but that's what I basically was doing. So we got, and then my father went once into the woods. The minute you could get, we had curfew, by the way, 8 in the evening till 6 in the morning. So he'd get up at 6 and see if he could chop down a small tree, and then we could feed that into the actual little stove, because that took bigger things, but that, of course, heated us much better. So we had big pieces of wood. We'd start the little one for a little while and get warm, and otherwise it was cooking on this little tin. So it got so that I would go out with my bag to look for little bits of wood to feed in that little thing, and you couldn't find anything on the street. It was so picked up, you couldn't find the smallest piece of wood. I remember walking around seeing there's not even this big a piece of wood lying around. It had been completely cleared. And that was really astonishing. I couldn't find anything. And those woods were really decimated. They're back now. I've been back, and it's a nice woods again, but that's been 50 years, 60 years. So that's all come back. But it's amazing how we demolished those woods. I spoke to Leslie yesterday, who reminded me of an incident which occurred when I was traveling with my father. We were on the streetcar together going somewhere, and there were still streetcars running. There were still cars here and there. This must have been in 43. And a soldier somehow got in the way of the streetcar and tumbled over a car and sort of made a funny bounce off the car back onto the sidewalk. And my father laughed. It was not terribly amusing, but what was amusing, it was just kind of fun to see a German soldier get into a little speck of trouble. But he was okay. So the streetcar continued on and stopped at the next stop. And a man came up, went up to my father and said, "I want you to get off the streetcar. I want to take you to the police headquarters because you were disrespectful to a German soldier." He was a Dutchman. So my father refused to get off the car. So then the conductor came and said, "I've really got to get going. We can't keep this car going forever." So my father and I got off the car, and the man demanded my father's identity and wanted him to come with him. And my father said, "I'm not going to give you my identity. I'm not going with you." In the meanwhile, a little crowd had gathered around, looking not terribly friendly towards this man. And then a German soldier walked by. So the man immediately ran up to the German soldier and said, "Please grab this man and take him for me because I don't know quite what he said." And the German soldier saw this little crowd gathering and said he was not going to have anything to do with it. He walked right on it and said, "No, and went on. At which point my father just walked off, and I walked off with him, and everybody walked off, and the poor man, I didn't look back. He must have been a bit frustrated. Anyway, that's reminded me of that story. To continue about our cooking in our little stove, of course we had no light to read by. So we used to get the underground newspaper delivered to us every night just before curfew time. And we would pick it up and bring it in. And my mother had fashioned a light from men's hair oil in which she floated a wick of some sort. And with that little light practically in his face, my father would read us this little newspaper. It was like one page, two sides of a page, in which they wrote whatever was happening in Holland in the way of the underground, and what was happening in Germany, what was happening in the war, where the war was. And of course, interestingly enough, it never matched with what the newspapers told us. If there was a battle somewhere, they wouldn't mention it if they lost it. And of course, it would be mentioned in this Dutch newspaper. So we had a big map on the wall of the whole European theatre, and we put it according to the underground information, which was correct. They got it from England. And we sometimes wondered if somebody came in to search our house, would they see that we had not the correct information. We didn't have the German information. That was sort of, a lot further back. But I'll never forget one incident when my father was reading with his little light about the Battle of Warsaw. And this was not the horrible battle they had in 41 or 2, which involved Jews. This was a battle in 44, in the winter of 44, as it was going on as he was reading to us, between the Germans and the Warsaw population, and the Russians who were coming in to take over Warsaw from the Germans. They defeated the Germans and were basically waiting outside the city walls to take over when the Germans would leave. And the Germans first created total havoc. They slaughtered people. They were just Polish people, not necessarily anybody in particular. And as they were fighting, the radio station would play a piece by Chopin, which is, I believe, the Funeral March. And they kept playing it over and over and over again till they were finally taken over and stopped. Anyway, then the Russians came in when the Germans finally retreated on the other side. The Germans came in and finished the job that the Germans had done. And they waited for the Germans to finish their job, even though emissaries were sent from Warsaw to the Russians, said, please come and rescue us. We'll welcome you. We'll, open our gates, but the Germans are killing us all. And I thought they thought it was just fine. Let the Germans kill us. It's a job done for us. And he read his whole page. And there was a description of a battle between the Poles and the Germans, where they were fighting in a piano factory, literally from piano to piano. And that phrase struck me as so powerful that I never got it out of my mind. It just, to think that you're fighting from piano to piano, it's just a battle, hand-to-hand battle. Anyway, that was one of the more moving things that came out of these news letters that my father read. A number of my family members were involved in the underground. The ones who started right after the war, of course, took the greatest risk. They had no idea how the war was going. Things were going very bad for a very long time. They were the real heroes. And my Uncle Nick was amongst them. After he was released from this concentration camp, he got very involved, but he never told me what he did. But he had a fairly prominent position in the underground. And the only thing he ever told me about it was that little old ladies made the best couriers because nobody would suspect them of carrying messages. Then my sister Honey was involved for quite a while. And she never told us much about that either, but I know that she carried newspapers like the ones we were read to by our father to different places to be distributed, among other places. And she walked along the street in The Hague, and she was carrying a whole bundle of them under her winter coat. And as this German soldier approached, she dropped them all, scattered all over the pavement, and she, of course, was horrified and started picking them up. And the German soldier very helpfully helped her pick them up and went on his way. My sister went on her way, and her heart was pounding, but he never suspected anything. He was not a Gestapo or an SS. He was just a simple soldier. He just wanted to be kind, They were that kind. But it's hard for us to acknowledge that there were any good soldiers anywhere. Certainly not good German soldiers. And then, after the defeat in Arnhem in September of 1944, my sister Jackie started doing some courier work, by which time we then knew that the end was near. It couldn't last. It did last another whole winter. However, everybody knew that the Germans couldn't last. The bombings were terrible. So somebody said, well, they could use more couriers. So I said, I'll do that. And I started doing it. And a friend of mine, I recruited her, and she was eager to do it. So we thought it was very exciting. We weren't feeling like patriots. We just thought it was exciting work. And it turned out not to be at all exciting. Because all you did was courier work. So the underground did give us newspapers, bicycles, with which you could then bike from one spot to another spot, delivering messages, which are tiny little scraps of paper we tucked somewhere in our clothing. And then we dropped them off and then come back. And so my sister and I did this. We had a different route each. And my friend had yet another route, I think. But we were not the heroes the underground workers were, who were facing total unknowns. We knew it was going to be over, so we almost did it. Not quite for a lark, but it was sort of an interesting thing to do. We thought very exciting. Well, I had some scary experiences actually, which didn't affect me directly, but I never really talk about it a lot because it's sort of unpleasant. I was biking along one day to deliver a message to another little town nearby, and the streets were empty. There was nobody in the streets. There were no cars, there were no bicycles, no people. This was in the middle of the Hunger winter. And people weren't about. The city was deserted. So I was biking by myself, and I saw I had two German soldiers standing there and something on the ground. And as I biked past, I saw it was a Dutch policeman who had been shot. And I found out later the German soldiers were watching that his family would not pick him up and take him home, which is sort of a nasty thing. They made him lie in the street for days. I heard this later on. But they were just standing there. They were on the other side of the street. I was so shocked I almost fell off my bike. But I went on and delivered my message. And on the way home, it was cold and it was raining, and I went over a drawbridge made of metal, and the wind howled through all the metal bars, and it made a horrible eerie sound. And the water of the canal right next to me was so whipped up by the wind that it got me all wet. So I bicycled home, and I was a wreck by the time I got home. I was just so awful that I became ill. I actually took to my bed, and I was really sick to my stomach, and my mother didn't know what I had, and I was in bed for at least a week, I think. And I didn't realize, and then I couldn't go back. I was so scared. I decided I'd done my work. I'd done it all throughout the winter. So I chickened out, basically. And I realized later that I probably had just a nervous reaction, when you get something that just really scares you, your stomach gets upset. And I thought I was really sick with some bug, but I don't think I was. And my sister continued it on for a while, but then, the war kind of came to a close. I think I must have been very close to the war, because actually I then did meet with a group. I must have gone almost to the end of the war, because they asked me to come back. We were given certificates as couriers in case, as the occupiers became present in our country, we could run messages back and forth. That was perfectly safe, and we had little passes that we could use. I found out later that the organization I belonged to was called the Rolls-Royce Underground. I don't know who named it that, but I saw reference to it in a little book that was written about the underground in Holland, and he mentioned the Rolls-Royce, and I thought, well, I was a member of that. But I did not go back very quickly. I think I did go back at some point, but then the war was almost over, and I still have a little certificate that says I'm an official courier and I am running for the Dutch Armed Forces. I will relay messages. Turned out they came with cars and everything, and they didn't need couriers on a bike, young girls on a bike, so the whole thing was kind of ridiculous. But they were just being prepared. And I remember my friend and my sister, went to the meetings at what we might have to do, in case we were required to do anything. I had one other interesting experience. I was given a new bike by the underground. And you have to know there were no bikes. Nobody had bikes anymore. This was a shiny new bike that they'd hidden somewhere. But they usually would beat them up and make them look dirty and old. But they hadn't had time, so they gave it to me so I could run these errands. And here I was running along this fairly deserted street. There was a woman behind me on a bike, a really beat-up bike. And across the street comes this German soldier on a bike. But he had a very old beat-up bike, and he saw my bike, and he looked at it, and he started heading towards me, yelling something at me. But he didn't know how to ride a bike very well. So I really stepped on it, and he missed me. I went right past him, he missed me, and bumped into the woman behind me. I didn't look around, but I know I took her bike, but I heard her shouting that she didn't want to give her bike. And I had this beautiful new bike. I couldn't give it up, so I biked away like mad, and he was shouting at me to stop. And then they were shouting with this poor woman, who I'm sure gave up her bike. And so I escaped. But my sister Jackie had a similar experience where she didn't stop for a soldier, told her to stop so he could get her bike. And she was just about to go around the corner, and she looked back, and he was standing with a gun. And she just went around the corner and backed away furiously. So I don't know whether he would have shot her or not. But underground work, you could be picked up and shot. Did I mention about my friends who were picked up yet? Well, there were two friends. Oh, didn't I? About the girl who said you don't know when they play with dolls? She was a courier like I was, and she walked into this safe house where she was to deliver her messages. And there were the Gestapo, the German Gestapo, waiting for her. And they picked up all the other people, and they gathered them all together and put them in the Oranje Hotel. I did tell you about the Oranje Hotel. So she was kept there a few days, and then the commandant of the jail called her and said, I'm releasing you. She was only 15 at the time, or maybe 16. He said, you should be playing with your dolls. And she told me very proudly, I told him, you don't know at what age girls still play with dolls. Anyway, they released her and she went off. Another friend lived temporarily, because she had been evicted from her house, in an office headquarters of the Justice Department. Her father had been a judge of the Supreme Court in Holland. And they had rooms over on top of an archway. And one day she was looking out of her window and saw that in the other side of the archway, the Germans were waiting for anybody who came through, and they'd take their bikes. So she ran to the other side and began to wave the people away. They said, they're taking your bike, go back. So a lot of bicyclists turned around. Finally, the Germans came around and saw her doing this, and they went, and they didn't say anything. They left. Next morning, she went to school. The minute she pulled the door shut behind her, there was a Gestapo waiting for her. Took her downstairs. There were a little group waiting with another Gestapo on the street. and they said, we're going to take you and we're going to take a streetcar. For some reason, there were still streetcars, but they had no car. So we all herded on the streetcar, and they weren't well organized. She got on the streetcar, and as it started, she realized the leaders, those two Gestapo, were sort of in the front. So she just got off as it went, and quickly went around the corner somewhere else and ran to a friend's house. And the friend took her in and notified her parents, who didn't know a thing about this because they didn't allow her to ring the bell and say, they're here to pick me up. So they knew she was safe. The next day, the Gestapo came knocking on the door looking for her. And the parents said, well, we have no idea. She disappeared yesterday. And so anyway, they came back a number of times to look for her. But finally they gave up. So she stayed underground for a while, staying with friends, and eventually she came back. They couldn't waste all the time looking for 16 or 17-year-old girls who just, all they did was stop people from coming into the archway to have their bikes taken away. But I never really never did anything like that. And my underground work, we did once, my sister and I got kind of curious. If they actually saw you with the underground, it could be very nasty, and whether they would have shot us, I don't know, but they were getting very trigger happy toward the end. So there was a possibility, which we never even thought about. I don't know why not. But we opened some of the messages, and there'd be a message of somebody sitting, say, in a cross-section somewhere, saying at 2 p.m., 2 trucks passed with 4 soldiers in it. And 2:25, a bicycle with a German soldier. And at 3 o'clock, a tank passed, going, which way they were going. And we thought, that seems like sort of trivial information. I don't think that anybody put that information together and said, now there were 4 trucks that went east and 2 went west, and maybe that means something in the way troop movements. So I think it was probably trivial information. Maybe not, but I kind of suspect it was. So that's my story about my underground work. My Uncle Nick, who lived at some point close to us, I understood I didn't notice till after the war, but he was a very active underground worker. And I believe that he ran a bunch of couriers, but he did other things beside. He never told us, of course, we never knew. I had no idea that he did this. And the only thing he told us about his work was that old ladies made such good couriers. I think old ladies and young girls probably, but he didn't use young girls, he used old ladies. The other thing I should mention is when my friend was picked up and taken to jail, she was taken to a place called Oranje Hotel, which means the Orange Hotel, orange being the Dutch royal family's color. So it's the House of Orange that is our royal family. The Orange Hotel was part of the military barracks, and it was their prison, which was converted by the Germans to a prison for all the underground workers and other people also. But all the underground workers in our area at least went to the Orange Hotel, where they were kept. I don't know if they were tortured, but most likely they were, for any information they had about people they knew, which is why the underground never used names. I was given another name. They only knew me by, I don't know what my name was anymore, but it wasn't Lucy. My sister wasn't Jackie, my friend Sonia wasn't either. And we were given other names for the people who, some of them I even knew actually, but it went by another name. So when you exchange messages, you're giving it to Ilsa and somebody else gives it to you, So you couldn't give any names if you got caught. You could give addresses, but I'm not sure I could have. I always had poor memory. I was always afraid I was going to forget an address. So that's where these people were taken. But again, they were tortured, and there was sure information they could give that maybe they got out of them and maybe they didn't. There also was some beautiful poetry written by those people in jail who knew they were going to die. I mean, that was it. and I will try to find some of it and maybe translate it. But what happened to those people, they were then transported to the dunes, to which we had no access since they built this wall across The Hague, and they were shot. And they shot I don't know how many people. It was never announced. Till maybe later when you heard so-and-so were shot. Sometimes there were placards on the streets put up by the Germans, we shot X number of people, or they would usually make it known because it was something to scare us. You know, don't work in the underground because that's where it will happen to you. They now have a ceremony every May 10th where they go to the dunes where they were shot, and they have a little memorial for those people, the underground workers who were shot. So that's all I can tell you about that. Right after the war, when the Germans were well established, they picked up hostages from all over the country, and they were prominent people or prominent families, lawyers, doctors, judges, anybody who had some kind of a name or reputation, and they filled a concentration camp with all these people. And my Uncle Nick was one of them. So we were all in a panic, of course, because the reason they take hostages is, of course, something happens that Germans don't like. They would take a hostage and shoot him and set an example. So I remember we got lawyers to talk with the Germans, and they were totally ineffective. But I think we could get letters, and we could send packages. So I don't remember how long he was there, but when he came home, he looked tanned because it was still in the summer. You know, we were occupied in May, and I think he spent most of the summer, part of the fall, in the concentration camp. For some reason, they released him. It could have been health problems, because he did have some. And the tales he told were wonderful. He had plenty of food, because everybody sends him packages. They had a vacation. They would organize football games between, this would be soccer, between the judges versus the lawyers, or the doctors versus the mayors of the towns. And apparently they had a wonderful time. The Germans did not actually enforce anything. They were just there and they behaved themselves. So he got to know a lot of people, which I think was probably useful to him in his subsequent underground work, which he undertook. Which he did for the most part for during most of the war. Of course, he never told us about that. We had no idea. We never told him that we did anything. My sister never told him. But we found out about it after the war, and he mentioned a little bit. He never said much about it. So that's all I can tell you about old Nick, except that it was like a wonderful vacation. My father never did underground work because he was going deaf, and that was not a desirable trait at all. He did not have a hearing aid, and you could not get hearing aids. The trouble was that if you were in the underground and you were asked to do something, you would meet somebody in a garden or in a corner somewhere, and you'd say, you know, I'm Debbie, and you have to go and deliver this message, which you would hand to you surreptitiously, and you have to go to such and such an address, and you'd kind of whisper it in somebody's ear very quietly. And, you know, you couldn't shout it out in the street, and my father would have to have it shouted out. You didn't ever write it down. I would on occasion be so afraid I'd lose a number that I might write a number on a scrap of paper and stick in the bottom of my slacks and put the initials of the street and stick it in my ear. Well, not in my ear, but I could have done that, I think. So it would be very unobtrusive, but I tried not to do that if I could possibly help it. But that's why he really wasn't good for underground working, because you had to be quiet when people were doing other things like manufacturing fake IDs. And in fact, my father actually had been told by the Foreign Office that he had to move. He was not essential to anything in the east of Holland, so he had to move to the west of Holland, which none of us wanted to do. So that's how we got underground addresses and stayed underground for the remainder of the war, really. He was told in the beginning of the war to move. We didn't want to leave our schools, we didn't want to leave our friends. And so my father managed to get all these fake IDs for us, which gave us our proper addresses, and nobody questioned us on them. So there was a whole part of the underground we did nothing but arrange fake IDs for people, so also for the Jews, so they could get a fake ID and we could walk with that, either go underground or live on farms and be workers in the farms. And you know, if they were very dark haired and very dark eyed, they might dye their hair. But they were relatively safe with their fake IDs, and they're, you know, in farms isolated somewhere where they had good hiding places. And that's where a lot of Jews and underground workers hid. But that's about all I can say about that. The last year of the war, as I mentioned, we were staying in a house where we had lived before as children. There were 3 floors to the house, and each floor had a separate family living there. The top floor was occupied by the original family. They moved all the way to the attic and fixed it up beautifully. And so during the war, all throughout the war, whenever we closed our curtains, they had to be totally light-proof. So if any light shone out of your curtains, you could get your lights cut off for a certain, you would get fined, there were all sorts of problems. So every street, every block had their own sort of inspector who was appointed. One of the residents of that street was supposed to go around every night and check to see if there was any light coming out anywhere. So we had a lot of candles, but we still had electricity. So they would cut off your electricity if you had light shining out. So one of the people on the 3rd floor, whom we knew well because we lived with them, was in charge of inspecting that whole block. So not only was he the culprit, because somebody told on him that his curtains way up on the 3rd floor, and so he got fined, and the fine was, I think, 2 months no electricity. So there we were. It was just his floor, the whole house was shut down. So that's why my mother used all her candles, because we thought we'd get it back at some point. So we used all our candles. I did my homework by candle, and I did, you know, all of that. Everything was done by candlelight, and then our candles finished, and we didn't get our electricity back. There was a razzia, which occurred also in the middle of the war. A razzia being a similar to a pogrom, where they were looking for young men of certain ages, I think maybe 16 to I don't know what. So the order went out. We had notices that nobody could leave their house for a period of 24 hours. Because they were going to go door to door looking for men. They would search the houses. They were desperate at that point. They were losing. So we had to comply, and we all stayed indoors. Across the street from us, we could see them from our windows, was an orphanage house. The orphanage was mainly small kids, but they had a few bigger kids, and one kid was evidently of that age. And they put him out with a little suitcase with whatever. And they were told men of the age should stand at their front door, and we'll go by with our trucks and just pick them up. Of course, nobody stood out. They thought it was ridiculous, but this one kid was put out by this orphanage. And he stood there for a good half a day, till finally people gave him so many nasty calls that he better take that kid in, that they did. And I don't know whatever happened to that kid. But eventually we did have a German and an Austrian soldier knock on our door, and they went through the whole house, from top to bottom. The Austrian soldier was kind of interesting. He was an older man. He stood at the front door and told a young guy, who was a German of about 18, to go through the house. And he was obviously scared, because he didn't know what he might find. So he was very reluctant. So we started going on our downstairs and bumped into my father, who was in his 50s and above the age. So immediately thought he should take my father, but then somebody else said, no, he's out of the out of the age range. So I remember he had his weapon, and he would push with a bayonet, he would push a curtain aside and sort of look and see what was behind. But he was too scared to really do a thorough search. And there was a man in that house on the 3rd floor who was hiding in a very cleverly designed hiding place. He never found him, of course. He went through this whole big house, about 15 rooms, I think. And but he was so scared, it was kind of cute. And the Austrian was an older man, and he didn't want to do any of this, it was clear. So I'll stand watch at the front door, he said, and you go do that. And he was older, and the young kid, he was outranked him, obviously. So that was our experience. But it was really shocking to have this guy go through your house and look at everything and try to find it. But, you know, he was this young, scared kid. So they left, and I never did know if that kid across the street was picked up or not. But this was another, you know, awful thing. And I think they obviously they must have gotten people. Not everybody had hiding places. Although nobody, as far as I could see on our street, complied with the request that you stand out at your door and wait all day for trucks to come by and pick you up. Can you imagine you would do that? This orphanage was the only one, as far as I know. So that is the story of the razzia, which is the only one I was aware of other than the experience when they killed this policeman and left him on the street, and that was probably a part of another little razzia that was going on. Another memory, this occurred in the first part of the war, when we still lived at our original house that Peter and Hillary and the kids all saw. We were assigned a soldier to house. And so one day the officers came by and told us that we were going to take this one soldier. So he arrived, my mother prepared a room for him, and he seemed to be a pleasant chap, but of course being a German soldier, we never spoke to him. My mother showed him his room, said that's where your room is, that's where the kitchen is, we will give you your meals there. We were required to give food to these people. So this poor chap, who was quite sociable, tried to talk with us, and of course we totally cut him off and didn't respond. We had a live-in maid who cooked our meals, and she ate in the kitchen, and we ate in the dining room, and we had him eat in the kitchen with her. So she'd cook our meals, including hers and ours and his, and then she would slap his meal on some little table in the corner, take her meal, move a table away so she sat with her back to the soldier every day for every meal that he was there, and didn't talk to him. So he got very depressed, and one day he approached me on the stairs. He heard in the living room some English. He knew it wasn't German. I don't think he was sure what it was. My mother had some English friends who were legally there. So he asked me in German, who were these English-speaking people? Was it English, and who were they? Well, I looked at him and said, I don't know. Listen, I don't understand you. I understand it perfectly well, but I wasn't going to engage in conversation with him, and I went back up the stairs. But I was a little worried about it, and I went back later and told my parents to be a little quiet because he seemed suspicious. However, that led to nothing. It actually led to eventually this young soldier leaving and trying to find a place where his friends were, because he was very lonely in this house. So by and large, the German soldier, to my knowledge, in my area, behaved quite well. That's not to say the SS and these other Gestapo people behaved well, but the average soldier was well disciplined. They stayed in their barracks, and they really didn't bother anybody much. They were mainly not walking around loose. Occasionally you'd see a drunken soldier who got lost from his company, but I thought they were pretty disciplined. But to show another story which happened to my father returned from Persia shortly before the war and got caught in the war. And I think within a week after capitulation of Holland to Germany, he got a phone call from an ex-colleague from Tehran in Persia, a German colleague who arrived in The Hague. he was involved in some way with this whole occupation, and thought, well, I have a colleague here. I knew him well. We socialized in Tehran. So, and I'm sure he had other designs, thinking he could make him his friend and find things to be made easier if he could get some people like that to become friendly with. So he called my father and said, well, guess what? I'm here in The Hague, and can we have lunch together and talk? My father was totally stunned and said, well, I'm sorry, you're here. You occupied my country, and I can't talk with you. You're my enemy, and hung up on him. And he just came back into the living room, I remember, just dumbfounded that a fellow would just think he'd socialize with him. But this was typical of the top Germans. The top commandant of Germany of Holland was a German called something, his last name was Seyss-Inquart. He established himself in a very nice house in the middle of The Hague, near to where my sister lived, and expected Dutch society to take up his daughters and talk with him and socialize with him and have going out parties. And he discovered that the Dutch wouldn't talk to him or his daughters or anybody else. And this was apparently a totally astonishing development. There was another story that I have in connection with that. I was in high school then, and suddenly there appeared this German girl whose father was a German officer of some kind, and they decided, here we are in this Dutch country, it's very much like Germany, and we'll integrate, and our daughter's going to go to school here. And I remember her name was Inga or Ingrid. And so she came in, totally expecting to be part of it, and we all looked at her and thought, what is this German girl doing here? So we never spoke to her. We totally ignored her. If she spoke to anybody, we'd walk away. And I felt so bad because I remember I stammered, and occasionally I'd get stuck on a word, and she sat next to me and she'd whisper it to me, which would help me. And so I'd give her this little half smile because I wasn't comfortable about thanking her. She was a perfectly nice 12-year-old, and she eventually, her parents took her out. Of course, she had a miserable life. She was ignored at lunchtime. We all ate our sandwiches out in the garden, and she would stand by herself because if she approached us, we'd leave immediately. But this was another one of those things where the officer thought we'd be welcoming them. Which turns, in fact, in another story, which happened to my sister's friend in Amsterdam. She was accosted by this young kid, and she was about 24 then. No, she must have been younger. She was about 18 or 19. Who was another kid from a foreign country somewhere in Germany. And he just really wanted to be friends. He wasn't very violent or anything, and when she began to talk with him, he immediately was eager to talk with her, and he forgot all about any other designs he might have had. And he said he couldn't understand why people were so hostile towards him. And so she gave him a long lecture about, because he said, you lived under this horrible queen, and we were liberating you. And so she set him straight. She gave him a little history of Holland and how we were very happy with our queen. And he kept saying, oh, really, nobody told us that. Finally, he was very impressed. He said, could we meet again? I want to hear more about this. He didn't even have any designs. He was totally caught up in this, this whole other picture he got. So she made a date with him and got rid of him, and she, of course, never kept a date. But there was another example how the soldiers, the average kid, was told, this is an oppressed country and we're coming as liberators, and they will give us flowers, and like in Iraq, where it never happened. So that's another example of how dense or obtuse these Germans were, and how they were tricked, I think, by their commanders and saying how happy we would be, and maybe they really believed it. I don't know how they could have. Here's another story about search for food. My father went and searched for food. He walked all day and he came back and walked by a little bakery which was occasionally open. I don't know why, because he never had any bread or anything. But he stopped just to sit down for a few minutes. He knew the lady, and she was always very nice to him. And he told her how he'd walked and walked all day, probably walked 8 hours and had no food. And she was so sorry for him. She went down the back and she got a little bag of wheat and she gave it to him under the counter and said, "You go home with that." And so he came home and he had a little bag of flour that my mother somehow made something out of. And that was one of the sweeter stories of the war that, he chatted with her in the past and she felt so terrible that he walked all day and could get nothing. People like bakers could occasionally put things aside when they saw how things were going because they were given whatever flour there was. And the fact that she shared it was really very generous because it was very tough to get food. I'm asked to tell about the scariest moment in my life during that period. There were a number of them. The V2s were certainly very scary, but the most shocking thing to me was when I biked on my errands for the underground, which made it scarier yet, past the body of a Dutch policeman who was shot by 2 Germans who were standing watch over him so that his family would not take the body and give it a proper burial. And I was so distraught about that I almost fell off my bike. I almost lost my balance. And I think that I'd never seen a body before, and it was the only body I saw, which is more or less than a lot of people did. I think that was the most shocking moment for me, to think about him being dead and his family wanting to pick him up and take him home and bury him. And that was dreadful. I was asked what maybe most exciting moment in a way that were good moments, and that was when we heard that the Germans had capitulated and that the Allied were coming into The Hague. The Allied were basically a group of Canadians who had done a lot of fighting in the south of Holland. And they were aided by what we called the Oranje Brigade, which are the Dutch who were somehow managed to flee overseas or were already overseas, and they formed an army led by Prince Bernhard. So since The Hague was a major city in Holland, the Canadians yielded to the Orange Brigade, and so they entered The Hague first. And they were on their tanks with orange brigades and orange flags, and all the Dutch were out there along the streets waving their Dutch flags, which they'd been hiding all these years. And everybody went wild. It was just so exciting. I went downtown with my sister, and we waved and we yelled, and it was absolutely wonderful. And then after the Orange Brigade came by and went to wherever they went, then the Canadians came, and they were also very warmly greeted, of course. And then we had a very exciting thing too. A few days later, there was a knock on our door, and there was this Canadian officer. And he came carrying bread and sausage and all sorts of things. And they had been given to him by a friend of ours in Zeeland, who was a good old friend of ours. And she had become friendly with this Canadian soldier. So she asked him, he said, "I'm going to The Hague. That's my next stop." So she loaded him up with all this stuff. And he came in. He was the sweetest Canadian. He was a colonel or a captain or something. And he had tea and he had all these things in coffee, which we hadn't seen. In particular, I remember the bread. There was that's Zeeland bread, which is thick, heavy, big bread. And that was just the most exciting thing. I think there might have been butter, and he carted it all with him on his tank and found our address, which he had, fortunately. And there he was with all that food. I never forget that. It was another really exciting, and he was such a nice man, and he did all that for us, It was just so nice. So we ate well, and after that we had food galore. So one way or another, you know, they're pouring food into The Hague because they were starving. And that's the only way to get it to people. So it was very exciting. It was really wonderful. I never forget the big Zeeland bread. It's real country bread, you know, like you buy now at Whole Food, they have that nice bread. But so that's it for that event, but I'll never forget that. The very first time the V2 started going off in our neighborhood was in the winter of '44. And the Germans actually sent notices to everybody's house. They slipped things in the door that we should keep our windows open, and something was going to happen, and I don't know how they described it, but so we did to some degree. The problem was this was very cold outside, and we didn't open them very much. So we all went to bed peacefully, and in the middle of the night we heard this enormous roar, and the whole room was lit up in light. Remember, we had no lights, there was no electricity. And this roar and this light, and we just paralyzed in our beds, wondering, you know, what was happening. So this thing, evidently what happened, we heard this roar that kept going on, and the lights, and after some time we sort of began to isolate the roar. Evidently, as the thing moved away from us, you could begin to the noise down the ground, to the whatever makes it go up, lessened, and you could hear the rocket going up and up and up, and eventually disappeared. And we were just and also it broke all our windows. So that was when my father came with his candle. He still had a few candles, crunching over all the broken glass in the bedroom, the room where we were, to see if his daughters had survived this thing. And we were all just astonished by the whole thing. After that, we never had any more notices, but they let off a lot in our neighborhood, within blocks of our house, and mainly at night, so that the Allied couldn't see what was happening. And so we got used to it. But then, after some time, they would move around The Hague. So that was always at night, and then eventually moved out of our neighborhood and other neighborhoods. And I remember biking one morning near some little woods. I was then at Curry, and I was going a certain area. And suddenly this thing came rising up in the middle of the day. Oh, it was daylight, it was early in the morning, it was 8 o'clock probably, or 7 or so. So they didn't have to worry about bombs from the Allied. They were no longer looking for the V2s. Apparently they were doing this heavy bombing in Dresden and all those German towns, Aachen. So I think they pretty much left them alone, except occasionally they would find out where as they moved. It was difficult, of course, to know where to bomb them. But occasionally they would, probably through the underground here, it's going to be here, and then they would bomb that particular place, and sometimes they were successful, and sometimes not. It was kind of interesting. When I did the underground work, this is just an aside, there was a period when the area where Aunt Honey lived, a little closer into town, was bombed every morning at 8 o'clock. And the Allied, you could set your watch on it, they would come over. And I had to be beyond that place, deliver my message, and come back before 8 o'clock because I didn't want to be bombed. And it just still astounds me how I used to be on the way back and I'd hear the planes coming. I thought, gee, I better bike a little faster because they're going to come and bomb. And you know exactly where the line was. That was so peculiar. So they bombed a very pretty old section of The Hague intensively, and I never quite understood why, because I don't think the V2s were that common there. But maybe they were at one point, and they kept thinking, we'll keep bombing it. But it was, you'd walk around town, and all of a sudden you'd hear this thing go up from somewhere, not always near, but within, maybe 5 kilometers or so, and you'd see this thing go up in the air. And then you would watch it, because if it went right, it would go straight up, and then it would go like this and go straight to England. But then what would happen, it would go straight up and suddenly it went haywire, and it would go like this, and it would go like over here, and then it went back, and I always saw it aimed right at you. I kept looking at it, and I was sure it was going to land right where I stood. But the distances were, of course, always further, but it seemed, as it was really swinging all over the air with total out of control, that it could be anywhere, it's really scary. So that's really my V2 story. That was not really very seriously considered by the Allied, because I think that's when their big push was in the bombing of Germany. And I don't remember if I told you about the bombers going overhead every night. We were in bed, and every night the Allies would come with an enormous fleet of thousands of planes, and they flew over about, it was dark, between 8 and 9 in the evening. It was always at night. They were never shot at because the Germans had really lost, they just didn't have the equipment anymore. And they would go over for up to 2 hours. You could hear the drone from way up there going over to Germany. And then there'd be a period of quiet, and I don't remember how long. And then they'd all come back for 2 hours. It was just amazing. Every night this happened, that they went over to Germany and bombed. And you knew they were being bombed to bits and pieces, of course. But I remember thinking, they're sitting in their little cabins all lit up, we had no lights at all. And they'll come home and they'll get a cup of tea and something to eat. And I wish they'd, end the war fast, because it looked, we really wanted to be free. And I hoped that they would all come back, of course. And I think most of them did by that time, because the Germans had lost their ability to counter these huge attacks, and they ran out of anti-aircraft power and these kinds of things. So that was the winter when I was thinking how they'd go home and have something to eat and a cup of tea, that Honey and I were reading cookbooks. And I don't know if I mentioned that. We would just randomly open a cookbook and think, gee, how do you make chocolate pudding? And how do you make, what do bananas taste like, or pineapple? And how do you make, all these delicious things that we had nothing of it. Anyway, that was a tough and funny winter in a way. Well, we went into the hunger part a lot, and I've forgotten now precisely what the rations were. They were not enough to keep somebody alive. Did I tell you about my warning, alerting people that there were buses taking their children up to Friesland or Groningen? I did. I thought I did. And that didn't happen very often.
Maybe you should tell that one again, though.
Shall I tell it again?
Because you didn't mention finding the people.
Yes, I had to, we all accumulated somehow. I don't know how people got messages, it's sort of vague on that point, but I know that they were looking for people who still had sufficient food, that were strong enough they could walk, and my father was buying on the black market, and we had food, but a lot of people were very low on food, particularly in the poorer areas of The Hague. So somebody, I think it was a friend of my mother's actually, was very active in organizing, and occasionally would get permission for a bus to pick up these children at a given place and then take them to Friesland or Groningen. These are the northernmost provinces. They're mainly farm country, and they would stick them in farms, and they presumably were fed. So I was given a list of addresses. I don't even know if I had a map, but somehow I found my way. And I walked all day that day. I walked till I had to be home at 8 o'clock. Just barely made it in time. I remember stopping in a restaurant to see if there was anything to eat, and all they could give me was hot water with a bouillon cube. And so I drank that, and it really was very good, because it filled me up a little bit. Then I kept on walking. All these little families, and one of the worst ones was a family where there was a mother and I think 3 children in one bed, and that place was empty. They'd obviously burnt all their furniture. And they were just lying in bed huddled under a blanket. They looked pale and white and horrible and were starving. So I couldn't get any response out of them, and I remember saying, tomorrow or the day after, you got to be at such and such a place, or bring your children there. They all looked at me with these big eyes, and so I wrote it all out on a piece of paper and I put it somewhere, and I was hoping There might be a husband who might come home to see the note. Perhaps he was looking for food. And I don't know if he ever made it, of course. But that was awful, and that made me want to be a social worker after the war, which I didn't do in the end. But somebody said, well, you did something a little like it. I tutored children. So maybe I might say that. I don't know. So that's the end of my story about the V2s and the hunger, which, we were lucky. I think I mentioned that my mother traded a huge cheese for a diamond ring. And I think that's what really kept us alive. And I told you about going to the kitchens with our sled to get food. We got coupons, and often you couldn't buy anything with coupons. So then you went to those communal kitchens where they would accept your coupon and give you a pot of some kind of a soup or cereals. They were very thin. But if you had nothing, then there's where to get that. So I remember my sister and I taking our sled with a big pot on it, and we go to the communal kitchen and gave them 5 coupons for 5 of us, and they would ladle out this usually fairly thinnish broth with maybe a little potato and a little cereal. So that's what we did toward the end every night, because you couldn't get enough, really enough food even on the black markets toward the end. And then a very sad thing happened to our neighbors upstairs, where lived a very old lady. Did I tell you the story? And her rather peculiar son. And he had one daughter who was studying in the university, except nobody was studying, but she lived in the university town of Leiden. And she could not come very easily to The Hague back and forth. There was no transportation. Anyway, the mother of this man, who was middle-aged, I think, she was very old and always dressed in black, and she came down and wanted to talk to my father. And this is, mind you, in the middle of the winter when there was really no food. And she said, we don't quite know what to do about food. We're getting so very hungry. And what do you do about food? And we were still kind of alive, and my father was buying heavily into that. And we were shocked. So my father explained about black markets, and she didn't like that idea at all. But she was so thin, and my mother gave her some food that she had, and she just gave it to her to have. And a month or 2 later, this son comes staggering down and said, I think my mother is not well. I can't get her to get up. So my mother went upstairs. She was a doctor, and there was no doctors to be had. She figured maybe she was dead, and she could at least give that diagnosis. And she went up, and she indeed was dead in her bed. And we think she starved to death. They just had no sense what to do. And I think then the daughter came somehow. We got word to the daughter. And I think she took her brother somewhere. I don't know what she did. But somebody I know went to Friesland. She was about 2 years or a year and a half younger than I, and her family decided she was going to have to go to Friesland. And I remember seeing her right after the war. She came back immediately in some circuitous way. And she was all chubby and fat, and she'd been really fed well there, and it really was such a contrast. Everybody else was very skinny and pale. It was just amazing. During the same period I just talked about, I had a friend who had also been tossed out of her house, and she was living on the 3rd floor of somebody else's house. And the family where they lived with, there was a young man who was a few years older than we were. He might have been 20, because he was underground. And so he never ventured out a lot, but he did once. I don't know what he was doing, but they picked him up. At least that's what the assumption, he disappeared. The family never heard. Sonia was very fond of him, not that they were girlfriend, boyfriend, but they were good friends, living together in the same house. So nobody knew. They asked the Germans. They went to the commandant and asked if he knew anything, and they didn't know anything. However, sometime later, they got a little package with all his clothes. That's all they ever knew. So whether she went to the Rhino Hotel, which I mentioned to you, or was just shot in the dunes, or whether he was transported to Germany and died there, I don't know who even sent the package of clothing. It was just letting people know that he was gone. It was a horrible thing for his parents. And the other thing was when the Germans invaded, well, as you know, the Germans invaded Holland, and it took them 5 days to conquer Holland. I think we had very few planes, and the Germans really had a big might, and they just rolled all over Holland. And, well, another thing they did is they bombed Rotterdam, really very badly. And then they said, well, and if you don't capitulate, we will bomb Amsterdam, that's next, and then The Hague is third. So they had all picked the towns. There would have been nothing left of Amsterdam, it would have been just a... Anyway, so they capitulated. And then the Germans came into The Hague, very soon thereafter. So I and my sister or my friends, I don't know, we went to the big road, which is not far from Antoni's flat, and watched them come in. And there they came, and all the huge tanks and armored cars and God knows what all they had. I didn't even know what to call the things they had. And we compared it to the Dutch soldiers who were in evidence in The Hague for a little while, trying to man the anti-aircraft artillery. They were on their bicycles. And it's the contrast of the soldier on a bicycle versus the soldier on a tank. And that was it was all about, you know, how could Germany or Holland even think that they could do anything. We kept hoping they wouldn't come. We thought they might respect our neutrality, but the Germans were not so inclined. They were basically taken over. I told you about Seyss-Inquart wanting to be part of Dutch society, didn't I? I did tell you that, yeah, I thought so. That was not such a successful move. So that's all I can remember about the tanks, it's just that they were so huge and mighty.
Now, could you tell us about the Oranje Hotel? Because you've mentioned it a
Oranje
lot.
Hotel was a prison, which is nearly barracks, where the Dutch soldiers were and eventually taken over by the German soldiers. And it was called the Oranje Hotel because it mainly designed to hold the Dutch resistance fighters and anybody else who was bothering the Germans in one way or another. And the Oranje Hotel was named such because our royal family is the House of Orange. So everything was called the Oranje Hotel. And that's where all the underground workers went, and that's where they were mostly shot in the dunes later on. And that's where this one friend of mine spent a few days till she was released. Maybe I should preface that the Germans liked the Dutch beaches, so in the summer they'd be streaming to the Dutch beaches, the ones who lived close to the Dutch border. So that caused traffic jams on occasion and just a lot more traffic. So some clever German thought, I'll deal with that, and he put an ad in the Dutch newspaper saying, in effect, we are coming to use your beaches and to have vacation, and we advise you, why don't you, during this period when we come, it's a divine period, why don't you stay off the roads, so you won't create traffic jams. The intent was, you know, to solve traffic problems, but the Dutch, upon reading these ads, were just beside himself with fury. You know, can you believe, here we're coming, just stay out of the way so we can come. They've done it once before, you know, and they're coming again. I mean, people couldn't believe they put an ad in like that. I think they never did it again. And it caused a lot of commentary, to say the least. I think they have I hate to generalize, but I think the Germans are a little obtuse about many things. That's my German story that happened after the war. But it fits in with the German calling my father and, you know, the commandant expecting his daughter will be received in society, quote unquote. We didn't really have much of a society.